actually the documentation should be the first thought, not the afterthought. It can really make or break a situation when everyone's looking back on it later and there's a he said, she said, and you have no documentation to show what exactly occurred. You are listening to Legal Skinny Podcast with Trisha Barita. I'm a 15-year licensed practicing attorney in the state of Texas. I created Legal Skinny because when I've been invited to do educational seminars on different subjects in employment law, employers and HR professionals would often ask me, where can they find out a little more information on this or a little more information on that? Look, there's a lot of resources out there, but sometimes it's confusing and people are so busy. Sometimes people have only 30 or 15 or maybe even 5 minutes in their day to devote to learning something new. On this podcast, you'll hear me have discussions and interviews on topics relevant to employers. Disclaimer though, Legal Skinny is for entertainment and informational purposes only, not meant to provide legal advice and does not create an attorney-client relationship. Also, remember, laws change or they differ by jurisdiction, so this is not a substitute for seeking legal counsel in your jurisdiction on the current law applicable to you. Welcome to the Legal Skinny Brief, Documentation Why. So the reason this is called Documentation Why is because sometimes I feel like, documentation can sort of fall by the wayside when employers are trying to figure out how to best approach a situation. They are so concerned about the situation with the employee that they're maybe trying to solve, or whatever the HR issue may be, maybe with the workforce in general, that the documentation becomes sort of an afterthought. And I think that it's important to always remember that actually the documentation should be the first thought, not the afterthought. It can really make or break a situation when everyone's looking back on it later and there's a he said, she said, and you have no documentation to show what exactly occurred. What were the communications that happened between HR and the employee? It can be confusing, because sometimes maybe the management that originally was there when the decisions were made for this particular employee might no longer be employed. So if there's no documentation and you're just relying on, whoever's potential information is and their, verbal testimony about it, that could really hurt the situation for the employer to really have a full understanding of what exactly happened with certain employees and, what the best situation and action plan is moving forward. So I wanted to kind of talk a little bit more about like the actual specific documents that, are commonplace. And, a lot of employers don't have, the documentation there. And they may be asking themselves, documentation why? Where does it all kind of fall in? And isn't the most important thing to sort of, handle the situation appropriately versus worry about all the documentation? I think that kind of comes up, especially in, sometimes in HR situations, things are rushed, decisions need to be made. And, I think that that's sort of a confusing issue when you're trying to figure out, okay, can I just sort of fix and put the documentation in place later? And sometimes you can if it's appropriate, but sometimes you can't. And so it should be top of mind when trying to determine, how to deal with employees and how to communicate with them, or how to make sure that certain situations were documented. It's also important in the training piece, when trying to figure out how you can accurately train management to have an understanding of the importance of documentation. You could know documentation is incredibly important and have all the blank documents in place to be filled out. But if nobody's filling them out, then what good is that to have, maybe higher up management or the owner of the company or the CEO of the company know how important documentation is, but, the lower level managers don't. So it's also important because documentation isn't just for management and the higher ups in a company, but also for the employees to understand. It's a way for them to communicate and ask for things. So documentation on, certain types of leave, documentation on, whether or not they're going to be needing to just take, a sick day, or whether or not, they want to provide some information related to, their job, or how to communicate other different things to the employer. It can be key so that, both ways, the documentation can provide an accurate sort of employee file and accurate HR files. It's very helpful, of course. In the key piece of the first documentation would be to have handbooks, or a singular handbook. I mentioned multiple handbooks because sometimes there's a safety handbook, that may have OSHA specific related information separate, or some sort of particular, if it's a certain type of industry job, industry requirements that may be separate from the actual HR policies that may apply to everyone in the company. But certainly the handbook policies and having those written down can be very important documentation. Evidence of what the employer's intentions are. And then of course, having a handbook that hasn't been given to the employees isn't helpful. So some type of acknowledgement by the employee, helps the employer know that they communicated to the employee what it is that they have policies on, and what those policies are, and what the expectations are for the employees to follow those. This can all be really important because that documentation then leads itself into the next documentation, which would be, the disciplinary documentation. So while discipline may happen outside of a handbook policy for whatever reason, maybe it's a performance-related issue or some other issue, but sometimes and often handbook policies are used in the disciplinary documentation. And so, you're already sort of behind the 8 ball if you don't have the handbook policies in order to lead into the sort of disciplinary documentation. Now, some states have different rules related to what policies employers need to have versus others, but it's certainly important to understand that, if you don't have the policies, then, it's hard to sort of say later that you effectively tried to communicate those to the employee. You can always say that there was a verbal policy there. It's just sort of, what is the evidence of it? Who made the verbal policy? Who communicated that? And all the information related to that can be sort of this sort of ambiguity and vagueness that, you really probably want to try to avoid when you're really trying to create a workforce that has knowledge and understanding of what the policies of the company are. Now, when you get to the issues of discipline, there's several types of discipline that can often occur with employers. One of those that you'll see maybe is like this verbal warning. And, sometimes employers debate whether or not they should give verbal warnings. They do sort of document to the file. Sometimes that may be the only thing that's appropriate because there's a time issue and, there's not time to create the written documentation. But, a written warning where an employee acknowledges receipt of it, of course, is always going to show more and be less issue with being challenged as to whether or not it's what everyone agreed was actually put out and documented as the discipline, versus a verbal warning, which sometimes is just sort of a one-sided statement written down by management later at some point about what exactly occurred and what they communicated to the employee. Later the employee may say, well, that's not how I remember the discipline going, or I think they didn't tell me that, or they may just completely altogether say that there was no discipline. So the verbal warning document to the file, getting into that as the regular way that you're documenting may not be the most accurate way to create a disciplinary documentation for that employee. So considering how you can find the time to create written warning documentation would be probably something that most employers and HR professionals would find to be preferred. Of course, the documentation, if you're going to be conducting any reviews, especially if you're using those reviews as a basis for whether or not you're going to give reviews or, give bonuses or any type of raises. And that can be key later when you're looking back at why certain people were given raises or why certain people were given an opportunity at different positions, because maybe those quarterly or annual reviews, however you're doing them, really showed evidence that the individual employee was very successful at their management style, or they were very successful at performing, those essential functions of that job, and they exceeded expectations, and all that kind of can come out in those reviews. It's very often, though, that sometimes employers don't do annual reviews, and they may just sort of give discretionary bonuses all the same to the employee workforce, or maybe based on some type of seniority or some other issue related to performance. But if you don't have those annual reviews, then later on, it may be difficult to remember why, certain people got certain positions or certain people got certain bonuses. And so sometimes that's why those reviews are often tied to the decisions made to the bonuses or, access to different positions. So policy documentation, again, is another piece that employers may want to look at. When you have handbook policies, you may have to have other policy documentations outside of that. Those policy documents may relate to, temporary policies that you have. For instance, this summer we're going to, give a floating holiday, but it's not going to be happen every year. It's just because, certain things happen and the company is allowing for it. So those type of policy documents and providing that to the employee in a written format can be important, so you remember later on that you did it. Sometimes when you run a company for 5, 10, 15, 20 years, what you did in the past can become a little blurry. Or you may have multiple different types of management styles, and so making sure that all management is sort of treating everyone the same, and that there's no issue with how certain people are getting these benefits or certain people are getting those benefits. If you have some sort of documentation related to any sort of temporary policies as well, or notices to the employee, those can be key pieces to kind of making sure that you are treating the workforce in a non-discriminatory manner. Investigations are another key piece that you may see with documentation. So when an investigation is conducted, of course, you would want to actually have some sort of a documentation that you conducted the investigation. And when I'm talking about investigations, usually these are complaints made by the employee or some sort of accident or occurrence, making the employer need to conduct an investigation to sort of determine if there's some facts there that can lend themselves to whether or not a certain employee needs to be disciplined, or whether or not they need to be terminated, or whether or not there was some type of discrimination or something that occurred, so that the employer can make decisions about how they will determine the next steps for the employer to take. So if you conduct an investigation and you don't have any documentation of what it is you were doing during the investigation and who you interviewed and what those people said, that can get pretty confusing pretty quickly. clearly during the investigation, multiple people might be interviewed. And as you go through that interview of those individuals, you may have to go back and then re-interview certain individuals if, some of the facts don't add up. Well, having clear documentation through that can be a key piece to sort of patching it all together. And also remember that, memories aren't perfect. And so if you're relying on memory, that can be sort of a disadvantage, because when this investigation may be significant later on down the road, you don't know. So it could be a year or two from now, and all the things and all the people that were interviewed, they may no longer be there. Or again, like I discussed, the management that conducted the investigation may not be there. So figuring out what documentation is going to be part of the investigation should happen right at the beginning, and then it should be properly kept throughout the course of the investigation to get to the end, to the conclusion of any determinations that might be made, especially so that if there is a determination that's made outside of that investigation, employers will have some documentation to kind of back up why that determination was made. Another type of documentation that employers may be looking at having are types of leave. So FMLA leave, or leave that's needed as an accommodation under the Americans with Disabilities Act, or just vacation leave or sick leave, PTO. So again, that can be pretty tricky if you aren't documenting. Nowadays, a lot of employers maybe use apps for some of this type of stuff. Certainly, if they have time being put in through an app, there may be a way for the employee to request a sick day or vacation. But, there's some legal requirements that certain types of leave may need to be met, especially if there's some sort of medical documentation that's needed. So all those kinds of things can help the employer sort of create a clear paper trail so that individual employees are treated the same in the similar type leave situations, and so that there are no discriminatory practices, and that there's no issue of retaliation, so that everyone knows, hey, we have to be careful that we, don't retaliate against anyone who, is taking protected leave, and, we make sure that they can come back and get their position if it's FMLA or other types of issues related to that. And the documentation can kind of aid the employer maybe in helping with all that. Another type of documentation, which is important, and these kind of can be combined, are the safety issues that may occur. While clear, again, policies on safety are helpful for the employer to sort of communicate what's expected, maybe what's required even, certain things related to OSHA, certain particular requirements, state law or federal law or local laws. And so having some type of policies related to those safety issues, and then how to report issues with safety. So those might be, accidents that occur. Sometimes investigations come out of those safety issues as well. So having the clear policy of how you report that and some documentation for the employee to fill out can be very important. Also, if some safety issue is reported, having a documentation to give to the employee is also important for the management. So it's not all, again, just sort of a verbal discussion and everyone's looking back later trying to figure out what exactly was said and who reported what and what exactly, were the circumstances surrounding the particular situation. With insurance, they often require some of these types of documentation. And so the liability related to that and whether insurance is going to feel like you properly documented it for them, or they may come and do their own sort of investigation. Sometimes initial documentation will be needed in order for you to sort of trigger those insurance claims. And so having an understanding of what documentation is needed is also something employers should consider. And then, of course, termination notices is something that may not be required per se, but if you don't have a termination notice later on, maybe in the unemployment hearing, or if there's any sort of claim made by the employee, what the circumstances were surrounding the termination or even sometimes the resignation, without documentation can be confusing, and it can kind of set the employer back if they haven't, attempted to try to get clear documentation so that the file is complete upon the employee separation from work. So quite a few different things. This is why I always say, documentation. Why? Well, documentation can be key, right? And always kind of thinking, can I document this? How can I document that? And what can I do to sort of put all that together? That's kind of, that's the Legal Skinny on documentation why. So thanks for joining me and have a great day. Thanks for joining us on this episode of the Legal Skinny podcast. Do not forget to subscribe to get future podcast episodes. Also, check out legalskinny.com to join our newsletter and get details on all the educational resources we offer for the employer. Also, disclaimer, remember, Legal Skinny is for entertainment and informational purposes only, not meant to provide legal advice, and does not create an attorney-client relationship. Laws change or they differ by jurisdiction, so also remember this is not a substitute for seeking legal counsel in your jurisdiction on the current law applicable to you.